right, that is 4:03 in far North Queensland. I think there are a few people joining from other time zones, but this is a moment for me to just begin proceedings. And I'm going to do so by acknowledging the Irriganji people on whose land I live and work here in Cairns, and also to just say that the campus name of the Smithfield campus in Cairns is Nomumbada. It is loosely translates as a place of knowledge where we meet, and so it's appropriate for this place, but virtually we are joined in many other places, and you might like to acknowledge the land on which that you're joining us from in the chat, just to test out that chat function. It's a real pleasure once again to be a host of these seminars. We've had quite a number over the last 12 months or so. The Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing has been operating since about the middle of 2023. So we're past our 2-year mark and looking forward to many more activities in the next period. But today we are fortunate to have another one of our visiting fellows who is no longer visiting, who has returned to a colder clime than the one which she experienced a few weeks ago. Meg Brayshaw is the John Rowe Lecturer in Australian Literature at the University of Sydney, where she is sitting this afternoon. She's broadly interested in the intersection of literary cultures and forms with history, politics, and the environment. She's published on a range of topics, including Australian modernism, urban literature, melodrama, crime fiction, and the Anthropocene as narrative form. She's currently working on 2 projects, one of which we'll hear a little bit about today, a literary history of mining in Australia, and a monograph on Dimthna Cusack and Australian realism during the Cold War. At the Sydney University of Press, she's academic editor of the Sydney Studies in Australian Literature series. I should also say something about the legacy of Colin Roderick, who might also be described in similar ways for his contribution to Australian literature. For many years, for 2 decades, he was an editor at Angus and Robertson from the 1940s through to the middle of the 60s, and also was director of Angus and Robertson at that time, before he moved to North Queensland to be the inaugural professor of English literature here at James Cook University. Almost immediately, he brought the dynamic self that he was at Sydney and established the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, which was almost immediately followed by an annual lecture, which continues to this day, and also the Colin Roderick Literary Award, which is now known as the Margaret and Colin Roderick Literary Award, which will be announced in just a couple of weeks' time on the 10th of September. So keep an eye out for that, and many more activities that come from this part of the world. So with that roundabout introduction of Dr. Meg Brayshaw and also Colin Roderick, I'd like to invite Meg to speak to us this afternoon. Finding Gold in the Literary History of Mining in North Queensland, the Politics and Pleasures of Reading Sarah Campion's Burdekin trilogy in place. And I can say I witnessed Meg reading some of that book while she was here. Meg, welcome, and thank you for what is, I'm just really waiting for what will be an entertaining discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger, and thank you to the Roderick Centre and to the Gadi people on whose lands I deliver this talk. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their enduring care of country. So I want to begin today, if I may, somewhat speculatively, with rocks and repositories. Every morning during my time at James Cook University's Townsville campus, I walked through the Bicentennial Rock Garden. In deference to my Townsville-based colleagues for whom this is an everyday sight, I will only briefly describe the garden, which contains samples of Queensland's major rock systems, offering, as the explanatory plaque states, a story of how the bedrock foundations of the state and its geological assets were assembled. These assets include the valuable mineral and fossil fuel deposits that, to quote the plaque again, helped build the economy of Queensland. Each morning I walked past a chunk of shellbed embedded with coal from the North Bowen Basin and gold ore from Pachingo and Mount Leishon, and then I climbed the stairs of the Eddie Koiki Mabo Library to the Special Collections Reading Room, where I sat down to North Queensland resources of an entirely different composition, namely books. Oops. These books recorded the history of, or constructed fictions about, the extraction of the sort of rocks contained in the garden I had just walked through. In this way, my morning walk presented me with a perfect spatial metaphor for the project I was at JCU to work on, which can be broadly described as a history of mining in Australian literature, but is more specifically concerned with how the novel form has mapped this continent's many and varied landscapes of extraction, and in some cases, imagined how they might be differently and less destructively constituted. My walk through the garden also reminded me of other rocks I encounter most days, namely the sandstone blocks of my home institution's most famous buildings. This rock was thieved from the land of the Gadigal, who used it for tools and as a canvas for art and communication. The Piedmont quarries from which it was dug were nicknamed by their workers as Paradise, Purgatory, and Hellhole, with reference to the relative difficulty each presented for the digger. Apparently, most of the sandstone used for Sydney Uni came from Paradise, but I'm yet to confirm that for sure. This choice of building material, of course, provides us with the common metonym for elite Australian institutions of higher learning, the sandstone universities. This rock, therefore, makes me think about the relationship between extraction and the work done inside these universities, including by me. So I hope by now it's clear where I'm going with this talk of repositories and rocks, but if not, I will extrapolate. My intention this afternoon is twofold. I want to offer a reading of a remarkable entry in North Queensland's archive of mining fiction, Sarah Campion's Burdekin trilogy, but I also want to use that reading to think through some broader considerations of method, knowledge, and value. In an in-conversation I participated in last month with my fellow Roderick Fellows, Dr. Dash Moore and Kayvan Aliari, colleagues asked us to consider the stakes of what we do as scholars of Australian literature in a broken system and a burning world. While I make no claim to a full or final answer, I could not let the opportunity of this seminar pass without another attempt to offer at least a partial response to this crucial question. As my title's punning equation between mining and the research process indicates, I particularly want to address the common notion that at best the work we do as literary critics has nothing meaningful to offer in the fight against extractive capitalism, and at worst that there's something fundamentally extractivist about acts of research and criticism themselves. Accordingly, my talk today proceeds in three parts. First, I'll define the key terms and aims of my larger project and locate my work in North Queensland within it. Then I'll offer a reading of the Burdekin trilogy as a kind of speculative cartographic project, which produces through its satirical, tragic narrative a dialectical map of North Queensland that shows both the extensive negative impacts of mining on the region, but also impressions of an alternative system of relation between people, space, and nature. I will draw on my experiences visiting some of the landscapes Campion fictionalizes to consider the impact of imagined maps on how we relate to real places. And finally, I will pick up on key ideas from this reading to think through the differences between an extractive and what we might call an additive critical practice. When deciding how I would describe spaces affected by mining in my project, I settled on the term extractive landscape because it's the most capacious and elastic descriptor. Landscapes can be defined as meaningfully encountered, socially constructed and engaged entities whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and/or human factors. As geographers A. and Chauvel write, the process of resource extraction has the capacity to reform not just the physical terrain, but also the socio-cultural and political context on which it makes its mark. Therefore, mining landscapes must be understood as lived-in places imbued with complex histories, politics, and socio-cultural relations. This is exactly the kind of knowledge that the novel form can deliver. Understood in a Lucasian and Jamesonian sense as a kind of cognitive mapping, the novel is a figurative representation of individual or collective experience within larger social and spatial totalities. Moving as it does between the real and the imagined, the novel both maps relations in space and requires interpretation as a map itself. Robert Talley calls this process literary cartography and describes it as fundamentally dialectical. All novels, even those that accord with dominant power relations, produce maps that, if only through the critical reading of them, offer the outline of other modes of encountering landscape. My project aims to find and analyse examples of such maps in the history of mining in Australian literature in order to produce, I hope, what we might call a critical cartography of the extractive landscape on this continent. This project has to include contributions from North Queensland. The hunt for gold, tin, copper, and other minerals was a major force for the northern expansion of the colonial frontier. In his History of Queensland, Raymond Evan writes that miners were even more peremptory at shooting Aboriginal people on sight than pastoral workers were, and their large-scale invasions devastated fragile ecological balances, often inducing local famine. Though always more volatile than pastoralism, mining shaped the region's early economy to such an extent that historian B.J. Dalton writes that if 19th century Australia rode on the sheep's back, from 1870 to 1920, North Queensland travelled in the miner's ore cart. Writers have responded to this history in varied ways, from picaresque recollections of the goldfields published in local newspapers to nation-building historical fictions like Vance Palmer's Golconda trilogy. Some, like the often racist tales of Randolph Bedford and Jack McLaren, are largely forgotten, while others are firmly part of the current canon of Australian literature. I think here, of course, of Alexis Wright's Carpentaria, which is a contemporary classic of world standing that I'll return to briefly at the end of my talk. In many of these books, and certainly in Campion's trilogy, North Queensland is itself, to quote Elizabeth Perkins and Cheryl Taylor, a character. Contemporary scholarship on and from the region reflects the landscape shaping of its literary history. Christopher Spicer examines how the cyclone functions as an elastic metaphor and marker of place in a range of North Queensland fictions, often, quote, disrupting the time and space of the structured human everyday. Roger Osborne and Wayne Bradshaw recover the history of Victor Kennedy's short-lived magazine Northern Affairs, published out of Cairns, locating in it a unique aesthetic that they describe as a kind of proto-eco-poetry that both responded to regional specificity and participated in national efforts to define an identifiably Australian literary culture. Elizabeth Smythe and Cheryl Taylor focus on literary responses to extraction in the region. Smythe develops the genre of the sugarcane novel, arguing that centering the plant rather than contested land adds multidimensionality to typically geographic bounded anthropocentric ideas of the region. Taylor maps the, quote, discursively created mind of the mining city of Mount Isa, locating novels that challenge national mining mythologies by focusing on the dystopic female, migrant, and proletarian experiences. Along with Elizabeth Lawson, Taylor is also responsible for the only extended criticism on the Burdekin trilogy, in an essay that explores Campion's feminist and environmental figuring of the bush as a maternal force potentially more powerful than patriarchy and industry. Though I am an outsider to the region, I hope that my reading of the Burdekin books will contribute to this valuable conversation about the relationship of local literary culture to place, politics, and ecology. What we know of Campion is thanks to Elizabeth Lawson, who spearheaded an effort in the 1990s to ensure the English writer's place in Australian literary history. Sarah Campion was born Mary Rose Colton in June 1906 in Sussex. In her early years, she travelled widely in Europe, Canada, the USA, and Africa. She taught English to Jewish would-be immigrants in Hitler's Germany until she was thrown out in 1937. She then went to Australia and arrived in North Queensland on Anzac Day 1939. She worked as a cook on the Atherton Tablelands property of Major James Douglas Henry. Henry was a mining engineer who worked extensively in the Gulf of Carpentaria and other North Queensland mining regions, including Herberton. And I think it's fairly likely that Henry provided Campion with much of the knowledge that informs the many and varied scenes of mining in the trilogy. The outbreak of World War II prompted Campion's unwilling return to London in January 1940, where she ran a canteen on an underground platform bomb shelter during the Blitz. The first two novels in the trilogy, 1941's Mo Burdekin and Bonanza, published 1942, were written during this time, while the third book, The Pommy Cow, published in 44, was likely composed in London and Toronto, where Campion went to care for her elderly parents in September 1943. Cleaving closely to major events in the development of North Queensland from 1875 to 1906, the trilogy chases the fortunes of Moses Burdekin, a foundling spared by the flooding river that gives him his name and raised by a German Jewish exile in a failed mining settlement. From the age of 3, when he almost drowns attempting to dig for gold, Mo is possessed of an insatiable extractive desire. "I wanna be a prospector," the child announces not long after learning to talk. Variations of this term are repeated throughout the trilogy. The verb form to prospect carries two meanings: to explore or examine a region for minerals, or work a mine experimentally so as to assess its potential yield, or to conduct a survey or examination of, to evaluate in terms of future prospects. We see the first meaning in action through Mo's restless wanderings all over a richly imagined topography of extraction in North Queensland. We might use the second meaning to describe the broader project of the novels. Campion surveys North Queensland's past with a view to what it could be in the future. For her, this region offers the most potential for ethical, ecological, engaged inhabitation, but it is also the most endangered by settlers' worst instincts, not least the ruthless yet unthinking extractive desire embodied by Mo. Though Campion mixes real, imagined, and renamed places, the novels are full of detailed and precise description of North Queensland, which she defines in cartographic terms as the stretch of land between the 14th and 20th parallels. However, at the end of the second volume, Campion includes a note to the reader addressing what she calls grumblings about the geography of the novels, admitting that the Burdekin River has had some 100 miles of waterway added to it, much as Bohemia gained a seacoast on a far more important occasion. Rather than a simple, snappy response to persnickety critics, I read this note as crucial to Campion's cartographic project. It draws attention to the speculative nature of the novel's mapping of North Queensland, and what I want to argue is a subtle utopian impulse that compels it. Here I rely on Fredric Jameson's definition of utopia as not the representation of radical alternatives, but rather the imperative to imagine them. Jameson describes the utopian impulse as a hermeneutic, involving the detective work of a decipherment and a reading of utopian clues and traces in the landscape of the real, a theorization and interpretation of unconscious utopian investments in realities, large or small, which may in themselves be far from utopian in their actuality. Robert Talley suggests that all instances of literary cartography carry at least faint traces of the utopian impulse, because they produce maps not of what is, but what could be. And in the reading of them, the critic undertakes precisely the sort of detective work Jameson describes. In Campion's speculative cartographic project, the utopian impulse is sustained by the operation of genre. Genre offers what John Snyder calls prospects of power, which are at once and the same time symbolic or literary and dynamic or historical. Campion's prospect of power is satiric tragedy. As Alvin Cannon writes, satire and tragedy share a darkly serious view of the world, and in satiric tragedy, the satirist figure enacts a violence against the corrupted state. Campion achieves similar, not against the state itself necessarily, but certainly against the extractive logic that underlies it, through an omniscient narrator that acts as a satirist figure. This voice frequently interrupts and complicates Mo's perspective. To Mo, a hole in the ground means gold and riches. To the satirical narrator, it often brings destruction, disease, and death. In this way, the reader receives two very different views of the landscape, and the tension between them is crucial to the trilogy's dialectical project of literary cartography. Mo Burdekin opens with a prologue that Lawson calls perhaps the most brilliantly tempestuous tour de force in Australian bushwriting. In it, the flooding Burdekin River decimates whole tracts of land and an entire family, save for the baby who will become our protagonist. The novel's first sentence describes this in terms reminiscent of biblical justice, as Campion writes that the wet smote the new settlement. This word is used repeatedly in the trilogy, but most often paired with adjectives that undermine it. Settlements are ragged, tiny, and appalling. In the prologue, the natural takes precedent over the built environment. It is wind and water that map the landscape, as the storm rages through the novel's major locations, including Lucy's Gold and Jabiru, Campion's renamed Herberton. Inaugurating the trilogy's volumetric register of metaphor, which I would suggest was probably informed as much by her experiences in the Blitz as in North Queensland, Campion describes the water rising and the stuff of civilization sinking. Amongst the carnage is Mo's birth father, an Irish fossicker who's too busy staggering drunkenly about the disused workings and picking feebly at the tailings to notice the rising waters or attend to the burial of his dead wife. No matter for when he does get around to burying her, the floodwaters just bring her body up again, alongside that of a drowned bandicoot with its stomach blown open by gas and its legs restlessly worried by flies. You might be thinking here, if you know it, of Henry Handel Richardson's famous poem From the Fortunes of Richard Marnie, with its similarly dark vision of engulfment and desperation on the Victorian goldfields. I am sure Campion's extensive reading of Australian literature, she claimed that for the 4 years she spent writing Burdekin, she read nothing else, would have included Richardson's trilogy. And I'm happy to expand on some of the resonances in question time if anyone's interested. As the prologue continues, we follow the Fossickers' children, led by the resourceful eldest daughter Janie, as they attempt to flee the raging river. They carry with them a meagre heap of household goods, including a tea caddy with Queen Victoria and her Koh-i-Noor diamond enamelled upon it, a symbol that foreshadows the trilogy's interest in empire and extraction, not least in its engagement with the Boer War in the third book. Soon, however, Janie loses her footing and dies with a punctured skull, and the prologue ends with the slow submersion of all her siblings, except for an infant boy who is saved by the cradle in which he lies and a whim of the flooding river. The baby is taken in by Reuben Abraham, shopkeeper at the ragged riverside settlement of Lucy's Gold, named for the daughter of the Bates family who first arrived there as part of an endless, mostly unfulfilled search for that mineral. A Jewish man from Stuttgart, Reuben is an enigma to his neighbours, not least because he models a different mode of inhabitation. Though he once participated in what he calls the grueling, silly, heartbreaking struggle of digging for gold, he is now a man with no higher purpose than that of living peacefully to enjoy the life he had, a man who could make money but knew when to stop. In this town founded on the pursuit of individual wealth, Reuben is community-minded, if also slightly paternalistic. He hires otherwise useless husbands and fathers to undertake the long journey to collect goods from the coast, and in their absence feeds and clothes their families. Unlike his fossicking neighbours, Reuben loved the land for what it is, not for what it yielded, and seldom took the time to profit from the possibilities he saw in it. He liked, writes Campion, to turn his back on Lucy's Gold and stare across the river to the opposite bush. Later, that same bush is described as mapless, because one cannot conceive of a Leichhardt, which is Campion's name for Townsville, a Cairns, a sea beyond that thick, stippled barrier. Named here as significant nodes in the trade network that carried extracted resources from the region to the world. Instead of this map made by extractive capitalism, the passage figures space in terms of a natural abundance that exceeds attempts to quantify it. So much bush holding so many billions of leaves, twigs, stems, so many uncountable items of bird life, flitting and cawing and scoring and twittering, such astronomical numbers of ants. We might say then that in Reuben's literal and figurative turn towards the bush, we see sketched the outlines of the trilogy's first non-extractive map of North Queensland. But the residents of Lucy's Gold cannot allow this alternative mode of being to stand. When a young woman dies in childbirth, they accuse Reuben, who attempted to ease her unbearable pain with morphine, of deliberately murdering her. In what Lawson recognises as an allusion to the Holocaust, Reuben is found guilty and sentenced to a lengthy term in prison, where he will eventually die. After Reuben's imprisonment, Mo, aged 12, sets out for his promised lands, the goldfields near Mosman or Charters Towers, on a journey in which he can choose the path taken either by his adoptive father, Reuben, or his birth father, the feckless Fossicker. When Mo first announced his intentions to become a prospector, Reuben reluctantly respected the choice, but cautioned the boy to do it with craftsmanship. Campion uses variations of the term craft through the trilogy, where it means making and doing with careful attention and personal integrity. Later, another character admires a carefully crafted spear tip and remarks that Aboriginal people are the only true craftsmen in Australia. On his journey to Mosman Towers, Mo encounters a bowerbird and admires its neatly built bower, with its precious things displayed with such loving care. Though a rambunctious youth raised among the children of Lucy's Gold, who behead parrots for fun, Mo does not disturb the bird, but instead provides an offering of his own, a piece of fabric from his bright blue miner's shirt. In this moment, both the bowerbird and Mo embody craftsmanship, as Reuben would understand it. And Mo's journey through the bush is so pleasant that it was even in him to wish, Campion writes, that he might never see Mosman Towers, never find gold, since to do each would mean losing his bush and his solitude. Yet Mo is immediately ensorcelled when he arrives in Mosman Towers, around the time when its real-life equivalent was the richest goldfield in Australia. To the boy, the town is fantastic, a paradise, his own personal El Dorado. This is contrasted with the omniscient narrator's description of a ramshackle, dirty, untidy little place sprawling in the despoiled and sordid plain. Campion goes on to describe a volumetric geography of suffering. As hundreds of feet below the town, miners toiled, sweated, scraped, clawed, dug for gold, everywhere entombed, shut off from daylight, breathing foul air, men sweated for gold. Wide-scale gold mining no longer occurs in Charters Towers, but memories of it linger everywhere. When I went to the town, I visited the Columbia Poppet Head, which stood over a 545-metre mine shaft and was restored as a tourist site in the early 2000s. In Burdekin, a glimpse of the strange shapes of Windlass and Poppy Head and Battery on the horizon marks Mo's transition from meditative bush to fantastic town. Today, the Columbia Poppet Head stands in a rest area beside the new Goldwater Homemakers Centre and Business Park, in a curious visual metaphor of the region's transition away from an extractive and towards a service-based economy. The other tourist site at Gold Tower is the Wall of History, a large mosaic that tells a story of Charters Tower's development from 1872 to 1922. Walking its 80-metre length, visitors receive a historicist narrative of progress, which elides frontier violence and concludes with an ode to multiculturalism. But when we move closer to the mosaic, close enough to touch, the individual tiles and the spaces between them become more obvious. I think of Walter Benjamin on the ruins of modernity, the fleeting constellation that forms from the fragments and exposes, if only for a moment, the phantasmagoria of historicism. That small flash of other knowing, other being. After Reuben's death, Mo's inheritance leaves him reasonably wealthy. At the urging of his legal guardians, larrikin lawyers Ted and Tom, Mo travels with them to Jabiru, an up-and-coming tin mining settlement, and purchases on the outskirts of town a property called Frenchies, where he can live in a congenial collective that includes Ted and Tom, Mo's childhood friend Lucy, and in time an orphan Joey called Rue that Lucy takes in as Reuben once did the baby Mo. The only thing extracted from the land at Frenchies is vegetables. Though the shadow of death still lingers over the place, the previous owner committed suicide there, life at Frenchies suggests an approach of ethical, if eccentric, coalition, not unlike Reuben's approach at Lucy's Gold. With property and money in the bank, Mo no longer needs to go prospecting, but his extractive desire remains just as strong, so he turns away from life at Frenchies. Lucy, Tom, and Ted, Campion writes, existed now for Mo simply as a background for tin. He goes to Old Glory, an abandoned gold-turned tin field in Jabiru that I think was modelled at least partly on Herberton's Great Northern Tin Mine. The Old Glory is arguably the most significant location in the trilogy. A local resident tells Mo the story of the Irish fossicker and his family, drowned there in a great flood. But Mo isn't too disturbed by this tale. Staring across at the mine, Mo notes the mud pond that had drowned more men than the Irishmen, and a heap of animals too numerous to mention, whose remains, one supposed, still stank and rotted and festered at the slimy bottom. If the thing had a bottom, thought Mo, doubting. The seeming endlessness of these fetid depths do not scare Mo, but excite him. Afterwards, he describes the place to Tom. It's full of tin. That's where the Irishman was drowned. And Bob says there's a jinx on it. Nobody will go near it, but it's full of tin. From this point in the narrative, Mo's extractive desire becomes deathly. Part of the Herberton workings have been preserved and can be viewed by undertaking the Great Northern Mines Walk. The path is clearly marked and there are many signs warning walkers not to venture away from it. There are still open shafts hidden below the new growth and a worker could easily fall in. The walk is essentially a large loop, starting and concluding in the car park of the Herberton Mining Museum. One can, as I did, walk in circles again and again, seeing the same contaminated water, the same mullock heaps, the same gaping holes in the ground. As I walked, I thought of Julianne Lamont's recent meditation on the out and back, a hiking term for the route taken by a hiker who turns around and walks back the way they came, and its affordances as a model of critical practice and scholarly deportment. It is important, Lamont writes, to understand where you have been and where you are, to pay attention to what is changing and how. The out and back is not about refusing, she continues, but facing. We find resonances of the out and back in the structure of Campion's trilogy, especially in the second volume. Bonanza opens with a report from a local newspaper, dated 12 June 1899, that details Moe's discovery of a rich reef of gold, but then telescopes backwards in time so that this tale of fame and fortune is retold through a darker narrative of death and desecration. The article informs us that the find was a result of Moe's careful reading of geology. He read the earth of the old Hope Eternal mine and correctly surmised there would be gold lower down. As Bruce Braun explains, in the 19th century, the visual language of geology, wielded by both government agents and prospectors, made nature in newly colonized places legible and thus able to be drawn into global circuits of extractive capital. Again, however, Campion undermines this dominant narrative. As Moe becomes bored and stops reading, the laudatory account trails off, and our omniscient narrator informs us that we will soon receive the real story beneath this official tale of Burdekin and his bonanza. Don't read this tale, the narrator continues, if you want something rosy. It's not for the young and tender. So, what lies beneath a bonanza? The next chapter returns to 1893, the year Campion tells us of New Australia, William Lane's ill-fated utopian colony in Paraguay. Campion's reference to the famous experiment is not unusual. Australian literature has long been obsessed by it. Queenslanders were overrepresented amongst the would-be colonists, and Vance Palmer's Golconda trilogy also features a digger turned New Australian dreamer turned digger prophet character. Though New Australia does not escape Campion's satirical gaze, she's also fascinated by the power of the utopian impulse, even or especially when it's misdirected. Bonanza traces Moe's adventures in his late teenage years before the finding of his bonanza, which include an ill-considered affair with a publican's wife that leaves him literally holding the baby, his son Reuben or Benny, after the unfaithful Rose runs off with Moe's one-time prospecting mate, to whom Campion's satire gives the quintessential bushman's name of Clancy. To Moe, the baby, Benny, is a fleshy symbol of hope of a future other than Moe's own, and brighter. This future, of course, is extractive. He imagines tremendous things for the baby, tremendous conquering of rich territory yet to unfold, tremendous discovery of some goldfield richer than Gympie and Charters Towers, and I just noticed that she uses the real name there, and Croydon all rolled together. Yet Benny becomes seriously ill, and instead of staying at the small township of Curram, where a friendly, knowledgeable woman may have saved the child, Moe rejects community and collaboration and chooses to ride on alone into the bush where Benny dies. Significantly, Moe buries his dead child at the Old Glory, and the scene of this burial is, in my opinion, one of the most startling in the history of Australian mining fiction. Little by little, the earth that had so meagerly yielded him tin in the past now yielded itself and came crumbling away under his clawing hands. Bit by bit, a hole was scooped out big enough to cover Benny, who lay there looking wretchedly small in the flooding moonlight. From that light, Moe shut the baby's eyes for the last time, laid him in a hole with small hand folded, heaped on him earth and stones and twigs, and then more stones, grunting and moaning as he lugged these last from the nearby gullies. Moe finds his bonanza because in the wake of Benny's death, he turns back to mining with a ruthless and unfettered passion. Taylor suggests that the child is transmuted into gold. And indeed, there's something horrifying in the way Mo's final desperate act of love for his son, burying him and covering the grave with stones so his body won't be disturbed like that of the mother he never knew, is reversed by his desperate digging in the old workings, deeper and deeper, as if all hell, Campion writes, were at his heels yapping him on. So this is what lies beneath Burdekin's bonanza. A dead child once figured as a symbol of hope by his father, who despite wealth and fame quickly becomes bored with his profitable mine. It is this boredom that inspires Mo to enlist and serve in the Boer War. Campion's engagement with the conflict extends her map of extraction to include the world system. It is a war, she writes, caused by gold, greed, big business, diamonds, shares, and dividends. When Mo and his fellow diggers arrive on the Rand, they are surprised by how familiar it seems. It was a mine like any other in South Africa, Australia, Russia, or the distant Yukon. It was a mine like any other, like the unlovely things most of them knew in their native Victoria, New South Wales, or Queensland. When Mo returns to Queensland after deserting the army, he finds that his bonanza has been sold and is now owned by English shareholders. Now, Campion writes, the lone prospector is up against the steamroller advance of capitalism. Mo laments this new kind of gold mining with all the romance gone, a mere digging at daily wage for other men's wealth. The critique of capitalism rendered through the contrast between the individual digger and rapacious industry is reminiscent of Catherine Susanna Pritchard's Gold trilogy, the first volume of which was published 5 years after Campion concluded her Burdekin series. In Pritchard's socialist realist telling of the rise of Kalgoorlie, she emphasises the mateship, courage and collaboration of the early diggers, and renders it a blueprint for a communist utopia in Australia. Less beholden to the demands of ideological commitment, Campion recognises that unchecked exploitation of the earth is wrong, no matter if the profits go to the miner and his mates or to an English-run company. This is made clear by the structural intertwining of Benny's burial and the Bonanza's discovery. The trilogy ends, as any tragedy must, with Mo's death. Mo is out prospecting again and has been caught in the first big storm of the wet, just like his father 30 years before. Once more, the natural world maps the landscape, as Campion writes that all over this part of Queensland, from Rulgar to Mean to Babinda to Van Rook, this awful cloudburst was the worst in history. Mo dies after taking shelter beneath a dray stacked with provisions, which sinks and drowns him in liquid mud. Given the dray laden with commodities, he's crushed to death by capitalism. The last prospector to appear in the trilogy is the one who discovers Mo's fossilised corpse. He intends to report the find to police, but forgets after he strikes gold. The loss of Mo's body to the mud and to history is the trilogy's final tragedy wrought by extractive desire. Of course, the scene can be read otherwise. Ultimately, for all the omniscient narrator's satiric asides, readers are meant to enjoy Mo's adventures, and thus we cannot help but lament his tragic end. Potentially, his death then serves as a kind of sacralisation of the settler. Campion's figuring of Mo's relationship to Queensland does at times teeter away from acknowledgement of what Eileen Morton Robinson calls white possessive logic and towards nationalist and nativist sentiments. The satiric narrator can deliver lines that tell us that instead of a solid passion for the land, Mo's only interest in that land lay tearing it up to see what he could find beneath it, but seems to accept without question Mo's belief that the land is ultimately his. At the same time, there were repeated references to dispossession and frontier violence. Lucy recounts a story of deliberate poisoning. We are told of a settler who wants to hand the land back to Aboriginal people, the folk who owned it. Furthermore, in its efforts to point out settlers' hypocrisy, Campion's satire sometimes reproduces harmful stereotypes. Since Campion wrote, the literature of North Queensland has become richer and more diverse. We add contour and complexity to our critical cartography of mining in North Queensland by mapping, for instance, the Palmer River as it appears in Mirandi Rowe's Stone Sky Gold Mountain, traversed by the Chinese miners Campion barely mentions. Sketch in 2, Alexis writes Desperance from Carpentaria, which trades deathly desire for revelatory apocalypse. After the Gophorit mine and the town beside it are destroyed, an island, made from rubbish, yes, but fertile and rich with life, rises from the gulf in their place. Here, Wright eschews images of volumetric suffering for an insurgent figuration of the vertical, if I can borrow a term from Anna Kornblue. This phrase comes from a 2020 essay in which Kornblue addressed the diminishment of literary studies in the context of the larger crisis in the humanities and the biggest catastrophe of them all, anthropocentric climate change. I use it here at the end of my talk deliberately because I too would like to address, if only momentarily, this sorry state of affairs. In the essay, Kornblue argues that literary studies still matters, not least because of its capacity to offer, quote, synthetic, projective, and constructive affirmations, or insurgent figurations of the vertical. Devoted to the collective construction and preservation of knowledge, literary critics build things too. In a world system based on the taking and using of non-renewable resources, this is not nothing. No doubt the systems in which we work can be exploitative and extractive. In his new book, Burdekin, Universities, Politics and the Public Good, Graham Turner offers a perfect allegory for this dysfunction when he tells us that in 2023, the federal government taxed university students at a higher rate than it did the mining industry. But we do have some say over whether the work we do in these systems accords with or resists their logic. Kim Scott describes writing and storytelling as a carefully crafted edifice of words and hope for something more than survival in the space between us. Understood in this way, literature is a valuable resource, and I think we would all agree that we need to be careful how we use it. But unlike gold or coal, literature is endlessly renewable, and it has value far beyond the rate of exchange offered by the market. And accordingly, good criticism isn't extractive. It doesn't just mine meaning from literary texts, but reaches out in ethical and engaged ways to those texts and to the work of other critics to build new forms between and with and alongside them. This is criticism as an additive, not extractive process. Jonathan Cranmeck suggests similar when he refers to close reading as craft work. Close reading, he says, is the making of sentences from sentences that are already in the world. Like all forms of craft, the core business of our discipline is to know something about the world as you are situated in it and make something from it, all at the same time. I'm reminded here of Campion's emphasis on craft, understood as the making and doing of things with integrity and care. We glimpse craft work in action in Rubens' way of relating to his neighbours and nature in Lucy's Gold, and in the eccentric multi-species family at Frenchie's. Moe eschews these crafted collectives, but they remain there on the map Campion's novels make for us. When understood as a kind of critical cartographic practice, writing and reading fiction can offer countermaps of our broken and burning world that trouble, or at least remind us that it is still possible to trouble, the pernicious systems that led us here. I began this talk with rocks and repositories, and I end it with craft and collectivity. Embodied by the work of organisations like the Roderick Centre, these are the resources of our discipline, and we shouldn't be afraid to use them. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. I'm assuming everyone else can see those rounds of applause exploding on our screens. This is a more explosions, at least on mine. This is a moment for all of us to take in what Meg has given us this afternoon, and contribute either questions or comments or discussion of our own. Can do so either by turning off your microphone and asking questions directly, or dropping questions in the chat that I'll keep an eye out on as we proceed. Any questions from the floor?
I have one if I can jump in, Roger. This is Julianne.
Yes, Julianne. Go ahead.
Sorry, I've got my camera off because I've just been to the dentist. That was beautiful work, Meg. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you.
And I'm absolutely honoured that you mentioned my work in it as well about walking. But I wanted to ask the obvious question. I mean, I haven't read these books, and as you mentioned very briefly, Richard Marnie, and I just would love to hear your thoughts about it. It sounds so much in structure and scope and even tone that there are echoes of Richardson in there. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole another whole paper to be written about these two books, and Roger informed me that Campion's archives are at the University of Auckland, so I'm going to go over there and see if she's actually said anything about having read them. But I think, given the fact that she said she read all the great Australian books, Marnie had to have been on that list. And it's kind of like if you put Richard Marnie up against a funhouse mirror, you would get the Mo Burdekin books. So the tragedy of Marnie is there, but in this kind of satirical guise. And that I think is really fascinating. And both of them are kind of motivated by this kind of desperate, unfulfilled desire. But where Richardson tells the narrative straight, Campion doesn't and can't. And I think that's really interesting. And I think the prologue of Burdekin has to have been a response to the proem, because they're too similar in kind of the volumetric metaphor and the kind of sense of desperation that they create through the environment. And I haven't quite decided whether I just think this is Campion not being particularly inventive, or whether I think there's something else more interesting going on in the kind of dialogue that I think she was creating with this trilogy that I think at the time was already understood as being a great work of Australian literature, like the Australian novel. So I think it's really curious that she kind of apes it structurally in certain ways, but adds in this satirical voice, and the whole thing is kind of also destabilized by the kind of aping of the bush ethic, which she kind of uses but also satirizes. So which Richardson obviously is not invested in at all. So yes, I haven't quite worked out everything that I want to say about the two books, but the two series, but I think it's fascinating.
Thanks so much, and I agree.
Next
Is that
question.
Wayne with a hand up?
Oh, sorry, Wayne, I didn't see that little hand up.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
the hand sneaking up. Look, this isn't a very penetrating question, but I think it does. The funhouse mirror bit comes in. I'm curious about the place names. You did mention it. So many of them. I mean, Woolgar is real.
Yeah.
Gympie is real. Cairns is real. But then poor old Townsville. I mean, we want to forget Townsville, don't we? But Townsville becomes Leichhardt, which is two regions, but neither of which is Townsville.
Yeah, it's quite funny because I got excited when I realized that quote she'd used Charters Towers, because there's a moment when she refers to Townsville as Townsville and not Leichhardt. So she forgets, through the process of writing these books over 4 years, she forgets which towns she's fictionalized or renamed and which she hasn't. And because I don't know North Queensland, I was talking to the librarians in special collections, because there's some places where I think this could be a real place, but I don't know. Some of them she makes really obvious. So Herberton is very obvious. Charters Towers is very obvious. And there's that moment that I just discovered where she actually refers to Charters Towers. So I think the ones where really significant events and where she's a bit more cutting, they get renamed, but it's kind of obvious. But then Townsville, she spends some time in Leichhardt, and she's not very complimentary to it. But it is interesting because there's a whole thing about Leichhardt, Leichhardt's journals. And Leichhardt is kind of like, I think Cheryl Taylor has referred to Leichhardt's journals as like the alpha text. And so Campion's also satirizing that. So I think she wanted to bring Leichhardt in a more direct way, and so renaming Townsville in that way. But I don't think it was particularly systematic in any way. I think I think there's names that she liked because she liked the sound of them. Like she talks about Gympie a lot. Yeah, I think it was a protective metaphor mechanism, because for some of them, you know, she's quite cutting, but also it's very blurred. And I think she forgets. And I also think you can tell the fact that she's writing in 1940 from London, so she can't jump on and Google, and she's kind of going on memory and kind of recreating this kind of speculative geography of the land. Yeah.
Julianne did put a note in the comments. Meg, I'm not sure you see that. Rosa Praed calls Queensland Brisbane Leichhardt's land in at least one of her novels too. So it's something that's circulating across writers during this entire period.
Yeah.
Um,
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Shout out to our special collections librarians throughout that talk as well, and I want to do so as well. I see Dash Moore's in the virtual room as well, who also benefited from the special collections at JCU Library. And also Carol Ferrier is in the room as well, who's also been a part of the special collections story as well. I was thinking of that line of books that you had at the beginning, and I noticed a few names that would be obscure to everybody. Piers Elliott is somebody who I've come across in as a local, like a Townsville writer who is writing about Townsville, and I wasn't aware of the mystery of the Black Dagger, so I'm curious about that. But also, Glenville Pike was in that list of writers, and a few others who I didn't get there. I was wondering whether you've had a chance to read into any of those other novels, or maybe they were works of nonfiction, and how they've maybe informed your visit to the North, like those writers of like Glenville Pike in particular, as somebody who's a writer of this region, whether whether you saw yourself in engaging with those as the outsider, the person from the South who's come up to have a look around and see what's here, and then now you're back in Sydney contemplating the journey. I was just wondering how much that went through your mind. I'm sure you were pressed by locals from time to time about the visit in those terms. Any thoughts on that? And there's comments coming up in the chat we can look at in a minute as well.
Yeah. Oh, I just Hollow Air. I just saw that because it's just arrived on my Kobo. So I'm looking forward to. I've had it pre-ordered, so I'm looking forward to reading it. Yeah. I mean, that collection of books was entirely down to the special collections librarians who knew what to get out for me and to show me. And I really liked the fact that JCU Special Collections had a kind of North Queensland collection and this idea of reading in place. And I didn't get to read as much as I wanted to. And I was interested in what I was doing originally was kind of looking at the way the different forms that were produced. So there was the little collection that had collected sort of stories that were published in local newspapers in the 50s and 60s of people men who actually were in the diggings. And I'm also interested in how it seems like some of these things become received wisdom or received knowledge that get reproduced to the point where I think there's a kind of conversation that happens around the narratives of extraction that get reproduced, whether that's related to originary experience or whether sort of regions take on a sort of story that is then reproduced. I was interested in, Jack McLaren's, the way that he kind of adapts the adventure form for the specific region. So in one of his books, there's people are shipwrecked and they find a copper mine and they become fabulously wealthy. So I'm interested in the way these kind of generic forms get adapted to local space. But I think I've been really wanting to think more about the specifics of different extractive in landscapes and how that manifests in different forms. But it's still something that I'm working on. So get back to me and I'll tell you more.
Yep. So there's the question from Victoria that sort of follows on from that. so she'd love to know more about the reception history of this series, and that's just as you were talking. I'm curious about this as well, and some of the other books. If you've had a chance to do that, I just noticed like the her London publisher was Peter Davies, like throughout. And so
Yeah.
it is another case. Not only did she go to London, but these are Australian books that are published in London that have come back to Australia via that usual trajectory of its time.
Yeah, and
Reception?
yeah, I think one of the reasons why they're quite hard to find these days is because they were published through the war years. And so there were smaller print runs and there just weren't as many copies circulating. But I mean, yes, Peter Davies. And so my other theory is that there are definite shades of Seven Poor Men of Sydney in this book too. The kind of Stead's, this land that will give us gold but nothing to drink, that kind of thing. And Stead's novel was published by Peter Davies, but that's not to do with reception. On the whole, they were quite well received. In London and the UK, they were kind of viewed as exotica, as you would expect. I could only find one review that wasn't from a Queensland newspaper, that was from I think a Melbourne newspaper, that was saying Australians don't really talk like this. This woman knows nothing about us. How dare she? But that wasn't a Queensland reviewer. The Queensland reviewers, on the whole, were quite complimentary, and this idea that because she was already a well-established writer. I think she'd written 5 books. That she was kind of putting the region on the literary map, so to speak, and that they felt like she had done the place justice. But there was a very cranky Melbourne critic who did not like. I mean, she does the kind of. It's horrible to transcribe these books because she does the Dickensian Bushman's dialect, which is horrifying to read. But I was surprised that more reviewers, more Australian reviewers, didn't say anything of that. But I think they accepted the mode in which it was, this kind of picaresque satire, that it kind of worked. But after that, they get a mention in H.M. Green's History of Australian Literature. That's about it, apart from Cheryl Taylor and Elizabeth Lawson's essays in ALS. And the first book was republished in 1990, but the others haven't been. So they're not really cemented in the way that because I think they're a fascinating because we've got all those kind of mid-century trilogies, the Pritchard trilogy, the Palmer trilogy, the Richardson and Eleanor Darks, and they're a kind of funhouse mirror version of that I find really, really interesting. But they were, on the whole, they were well received both in the UK and in Australia, but really interesting because the UK was like, oh, look at these exotic weirdos, and Australia was like, this is an authentic, good account of us that now is in global world literary space. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. More work for you to do. I just noticed that you were referring to Delia's comment earlier there with Hollow Air, and Michael shooting off. So thanks from Michael before he heads off. Any other questions from people who've joined us this afternoon? This is a moment where I say going once, going twice, and going 3 times. And for thanks again, Meg, for the presentation this afternoon. Thanks for joining us here in the North for too short a time. It was really really good to have you with us, and to sort of add to the story that's been going on up here with the Roderick Centre. It's been wonderful to listen to what you've been doing in your time since you left us, and that it's an ongoing relationship. We look forward to continuing that relationship, and hopefully hosting you up here again sometime in the future. We'll certainly be in contact. with all of the questions that that are arising from the work that you've been doing. Take a look at the chat with the thanks from the people who have joined us here. For everyone who's joined us, thanks again for joining us for an afternoon's discussion. It looks like some of you are at home, many of you are still at work. Wherever you are, have a good evening, travel safely, and I look forward to welcoming you to another one of these seminars in the near future. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Appreciate it.